Do you want to reduce burn and grinding or eliminate rehardening burn, residual stresses, over-tempering, nasty brown, yellow, and blue marks? Stick around and we'll talk about a case study, a real-life company in the real world where I visited a company who had residual tensile stresses, and then what we did to get rid of those residual tensile stresses and make them compressive to keep those board pieces from cracking. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Go live. My name is Jeff Badger. I call myself the grinding doc. I've devoted my professional life to grinding, did a PhD in grinding, and have spent years of my life on the shop floor of many, many companies in 30 plus countries, just hanging out, doing the grinding experiments, improving processes, trying things, trying wheels, changing parameters, succeeding, failing, succeeding, figuring stuff out, reading the academic literature, converting the academic literature to plain English, and then teaching people in my courses how to grind better. And that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to take one little snippet of a real life situation of a company. And what we did, pretty straightforward stuff, nothing special, nothing super high tech, just understand grinding and how to eliminate their burn problem or their thermal damage problem. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So this is a residual stress profile. Now, residual stresses begin to occur when things get hot in the workpiece. It's this funky reaction between the workpiece, and the workpiece wants to expand, but it's restricted. But when it expands, it wants to expand because it gets hot, but then it's restricted by the surrounding material. And then it's that expansion they want to expand exceeds the yield stress, then we get permanent plastic deformation and compression, and then that causes the workpiece to, when it shrinks, when the cooling comes, and it could want to be smaller, so it's in a state of tension. And I don't expect you to remember all that because it's complicated, and I talk about it in the book of grinding in more detail. But basically, if you have tensile stresses are positive. Positive is in positive numbers, not positive as in good. Here we have tensile stresses in red that went from 400, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,400. Darn, we're getting close to the yield stress of the material, so we have a very weak material. And then we have some compressive stresses at the very surface due to plastic deformation, kind of like shot peening. Those are good. Those got down to around negative 200, but it was only at the very surface. And then below the surface, we had the tensile stresses, and those are bad because they cause the workpiece to crack. So this was a company that called me up, and they said, hey, man, we got a problem because we're making piston shafts, and our piston shafts are breaking. They're fine. They're not cracked, but we sent them into the field, and we put them in operation. And instead of lasting 10 years, they last a week, and then they crack. What's going on? They did a residual stress profile, and what they found was that they had residual tensile stresses up around 600 megapascals. That's kind of high. And they wanted to fix that. So I came in, had a couple days on the machine, or really just one day. And I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. And here's the situation. So they were grinding some kind of piston shaft between centers, cylindrical traverse grinding, smaller than this. It was probably about 10 or 12 millimeters in diameter, maybe half an inch. And here's what they were doing. Here are the three key mistakes they were making. Key mistake number one is they were using a really, really big grit, something like 46 mesh, when they should have used a 120 mesh wheel. So they used a really big mesh, 46, but in order to get the surface finish they needed on the workpiece, the only way they could do it with the 46 mesh was what? Dress the wheel really slow. So they dressed it really slow, and they made the big grit wheel dull. So the first step was we had to get a smaller grit wheel. So I said, hey, man, you got a 120 mesh wheel? And they said, well, we could order one. And I said, well, that'll take 6 to 8 weeks or whatever. Do you have any 120 mesh wheel lying around the factory? Okay. I don't care what grade it is. I don't care what grit type it is. It can be H grade or K grade. It can be white, pink, SG, whatever. But do you have a 120 mesh wheel? So we found a 120 mesh wheel, and I said, okay, good. Now we've got the right grit size. Now we're not going to dress the wheels dull. We're going to dress it sharp with a faster dress. So now we have a small grit wheel that's sharp. instead of a big grit wheel that's dull. And what I teach my customers in my course, the grinder's mantra is big and dull, bad, small and sharp, good. Big and dull, bad, small and sharp, good. We want our wheel to have small, sharp grits instead of big, dull grits. So we got that. We found a 120 mesh wheel. We dressed it sharp. Then the next thing was the overlap ratio of cylindrical traverse grinding. Now I talk about this a lot more in my course. I'm going to run through it here quickly. But what they were doing is they were taking a deep cut with a really fast workpiece RPM, something like 300 RPM. And so what happened is only a tiny sliver of the wheel is doing all the work. Their overlap ratio was some crazy number like 54. And I like overlap ratios in roughing of 1.2. 54 is a lot bigger than 1.10. And that was the other major problem they had. So they were asking a thin sliver to do all the work. They were traversing really slow with a really fast RPM. And I said, no. Here's what we're going to do. During traverse grinding, during rough grinding, we're going to use 90% of the wheel. We're going to have an overlap ratio close to 1, and we're going to remove most of the material. We're going to slow down that workpiece RPM. We're going to take a smaller cut, but we're going to traverse faster. Then when we go to finish grind, we're going to have an overlap ratio, not of 54, but maybe of 8 or 6 or 10 or 4 or 12 or something like that. And that bigger overlap ratio will give us a better surface finish. So we did that. Those were the two key things. Small and sharp, better than big or dull. Dress the wheel sharp, dress the small grit wheel sharp, and then use a reasonable overlap ratio for grinding. And we did that. And lo and behold, they sent the part out for X-ray diffraction measurements. And what happens? They got the nice blue curve. Compressive at the surface, and then neutral, nothing below the surface. So it's exactly what we want. Compressive is good, and then we don't want any tensile. We got the cycle time down from something like 15 minutes to 45 seconds. We didn't use any fancy new technology. We just used fundamental grinding parameters that I teach in my courses. And I teach this stuff. I heard from a company in the UK last week who took my one-day course on cylindrical grinding, and they said, but hey man, this has revolutionized how we grind. And they want me to visit them in the UK in March. That'll probably happen, to do more education for more people. And I didn't teach them anything super high tech. I just taught them the fundamentals of grinding, and it revolutionized how they grind. And cylindrical traverse grinding, there's a lot of ways you can screw it up. So you got to understand the basics. Like here, understand the basics. You eliminate your burr. You get your cycle time down from 15 minutes to 45 seconds. And this is not just theory. This is a real world production, real company. Pretty basic stuff. Just understand the basic parameters.